Hi, my name is Lily and welcome back to my channel and welcome to my first video for Autism Acceptance Month, where I'm going to be talking about how you can be a better ally. So thank you very much for the people who requested this video. I had never thought of doing a video like this, but it is a really great idea and it was asked for by some of my followers over on Instagram. If you have any other video requests for this month, let me know in the comments or get in touch with me on social media. I will be filming more videos about autism and the autism experience throughout this whole month. So I wanted to start this video with the most important thing, which is when you want to be a better ally to any community, you need to be listening to that community. So I'm really grateful that people have asked me as an autistic person how they can be a better ally to us, and I hope that people will take away a lot from this video. The biggest thing you can do to be a better ally to the autistic community is to follow the very simple phrase that we operate by, which is nothing about us without us. And this applies to pretty much every marginalised group in society. Nothing about us without us is pretty much what it says on the tin. If you're going to be making anything that's related to autism or about autism, autistic people should be involved. So whether that is you are going to be writing a book that has an autistic character in it, whether you want to make some educational content for your workplace about how to be more inclusive, you should always have autistic people involved in that process. We don't have to be the ones that create the thing, so if you're creating training materials, you don't have to get an autistic person to create it, but you should be getting autistic people to proofread, to vet, to sensitivity read these kinds of things. They should always be involved in the process at some stage to help find ways to improve it and to make sure that you are not spreading any misinformation. Misinformation is really common, and it's because a lot of the autistic spaces have been dominated by parents and relatives of autistic people, and so they will often be spreading misinformation based on their perspective rather than people listening to actually autistic people. So then that links as well to my other point, which is just to listen to us. If you have a question, the first thing you should be doing is asking autistic people. And yes, there will be cases when asking family members of autistic people is more appropriate, and that's usually about a specific autistic person's case where that autistic person cannot communicate for themselves, but most of the time there is a way that autistic people can communicate. Some people do not communicate verbally, but they communicate in other ways, so it's important to make sure that you've explored all the avenues you can. Some people will be able to communicate over text or text-to-speech style systems. There are plenty of ways that some may be able to communicate with you that aren't speaking. Some people may also even use things like sign language. So make sure you've explored those avenues before resorting to speaking to someone else on their behalf. It's also important to remember that autistic people have been drowned out for a really long time. Sometimes when you hear our perspectives, it can be a bit of a shock, but you shouldn't reject it just because it's not what you're used to hearing. I've seen this on reviews for non-fiction books about autism written by autistic people, where they will reject it because this so-and-so psychologist has said a different thing, when that psychologist is an incredibly ableist person. Now, my next point is to always respect the wishes of the autistic person you are interacting with at that moment in time. Now, I have explained before that autistic people in general as a community prefer identity first language, which would be saying autistic people rather than person with autism. It's important to remember there will always still be people out there who prefer person first language, which would be person with autism or has autism rather than is autistic, and it's important to respect that individual's wishes and to use those terminology when you're referring to that person and speaking to that person. Now, the next one is really important and it's going to take some explanation, but it's always important to support people who are self-diagnosed or who do not wish to pursue a professional diagnosis. Now, in an ideal world, everyone would be able to access a professional diagnosis and would want to get one if they suspect that they are autistic, but that's not reality. So accessing a diagnosis can be incredibly difficult. In some countries, it just isn't possible at all. They just don't diagnose these things, or the medical system is not set up for that level of diagnosis. In other places, they don't diagnose women, or they don't diagnose adults, so it can be really difficult for people who fall into those categories to be diagnosed. There's also a lot of things where it's much less likely that you'll be believed if you're an adult, if you're a woman, if you're a person of colour, if you have other disabilities. It's so much harder to persuade them that you might actually have this additional disability that you think you do. Then there's also the case of if someone does have an access to diagnosis but doesn't want to go through the process, you need to respect that as well. The biggest reasons for this are it could mean that the diagnosis can hinder things in their life, but it also could be that they just simply don't want to go through the trauma of medical diagnosis. Now, I'm not saying diagnosis is inherently traumatic, but there are some processes that people may find traumatic. Having to talk about your childhood could be very traumatic for someone who has had a difficult childhood. Having to talk about the way that you struggle with interactions can be very triggering. There are lots of steps of the process that people may just never want to go through. This is especially the case if they've already had to go through a similar diagnostic process and it has been very traumatic for them. And then there's other cases where people choose not to get diagnosed because it could impact their life negatively. There are still some jobs where people will think that neurodivergent people can't hold down that job and they will be rejected on that basis. There are places where having a diagnosis of being neurodivergent could mean that it's more difficult to adopt or to foster children, or that you're more likely to have your children taken away from you if you get reported to social services. So in those cases, it may actually be a matter of safety to not be diagnosed. I will always say that I am pro professional diagnosis where possible, but I am not a militant professional diagnosis advocate. I think if you can access it and it won't negatively impact your life, you should try, because there are lots of times where people will think that they are something, but they are actually something else. So ADHD and autism are very easy to mix up, especially in women. They present quite similarly for a lot of women, and so you may suspect that you have autism but you actually have ADHD, or you may suspect you have ADHD but you're actually autistic. So getting that professional diagnosis just means you know you definitely have found the correct diagnosis for you. And of course, in many ways having a diagnosis can be helpful, because in certain countries and certain areas you will get extra support if you are diagnosed, but sometimes those benefits don't outweigh the negatives for people, and it's always important to respect that and to never try and force someone to go and get a diagnosis if they don't want to. The next big thing is something that I find very frustrating and I wish more people would do, and that is the best way you can be an ally to all disabled people is to ask how you can help rather than assume how you can help. And that's just because people's support needs vary, even amongst people with the same diagnoses. It can vary day to day and it can vary person to person, so it's really important to always ask first. I tend to find that people try to accommodate me in ways that I don't find helpful, or they avoid accommodating me in the ways I find most helpful. So the best thing to do is always to ask. If you have suggestions, feel free to suggest those things if you feel it's an appropriate time, place and person, but don't assume that your suggestion will always be accepted. I say this because sometimes people have suggested things to me that I've never thought of before and I found them really helpful. So don't be afraid to say, hey, would this help? But always say, would it help, rather than just doing the thing assuming it will help. And of course, always accommodate as much as you can. Don't just accommodate people when it's convenient for you. Remember, they can't put away their disability just because it annoys you or is inconvenient in that moment. That person has to deal with it all the time, so your accommodations have to be available all the time. My next one is something that is broadly accepted for autistic people, and that is to always try and provide clear plans and expectations, and don't change those at the last minute or assume they would know they have changed without being told. We struggle a lot with uncertainty, so if you add more to it, you're not going to be our favourite person. This doesn't mean you can never ever change plans, but if you're someone who consistently changes plans at the last minute, then it's going to be very difficult for that autistic person in your life. Try to make sure you stick to your plans, you plan things in advance, and you are clear about what is going to happen. If you're trying to keep things a surprise, you can still try and be vague about it, but at least give some details so people can have expectations in their mind. This is true when you're creating plans with someone, but it's also true if, say, you are a manager of someone and you're giving them a task to do. Make sure the explanation is clear, the expectations are clear, and they have an opportunity to ask questions, and don't get annoyed if they have to ask a lot of questions, because it may just be that you think you've been really clear, but actually you're expecting people to read between the lines. This actually takes me on to my next point, which is to never assume that someone can read between the lines of what you're saying or can read the room. These are things that a lot of autistic people find very difficult. We often take things at face value and very literally. So if you're trying to be subtle or drop hints, it may be missed, and don't assume that autistic people are able to do that. If you personally know someone who's autistic who is really good at reading between the lines, that's totally fair. But as a sort of blanket allyship rule, try to be clear about what you're saying and not assuming that someone can read between the lines. The phrase read the room is something I really hate, because I don't understand what that means. I think it means to assume that someone can tell the vibe or the mood of the room. I don't know how anyone does that, but apparently you neurotypicals can. I cannot. So don't assume someone can do that. If you feel that someone is perhaps behaving inappropriately to the vibe of the room, maybe just subtly pull them aside and have a word with them about it. Don't just assume they're doing it on purpose, because if they're autistic, it may just be that they didn't know. The next one is one that is really, really big for me, and that is to always try to make sure it is clear that you are joking. Because if your joke isn't obvious, autistic people won't know that and they'll take it seriously. And I've had this happen quite a few times where someone has texted me like a joke and it's a sarcastic joke, and if you didn't know it was a joke, it would come across as very mean, and I thought that person didn't like me and was trying to be mean to me. And the simple ways you can do that is to add things like haha, or I don't know, other things like LMAO at the end. Use emojis to indicate you're joking. Just put JK at the end so people know you are joking. Don't assume that someone knows it's a joke. This even happens in person. Like, I get people trying to joke at me in person but saying it very deadpan, which is a very British way of telling jokes and very British humour, and I don't always pick up that it's a joke. I've kind of developed this defence mechanism now where I just automatically laugh at things because I think I've missed a joke, and then I get in trouble for laughing at things I shouldn't laugh at. So please don't create that in your friends. Please just make it clear when you are joking and when you are not. Next, I would say try to understand that for most autistic people, questions equal curiosity, not criticism. I had a lot of issues as a child where people would assume I was criticising them when I questioned what they were doing, but honestly, I was just trying to understand. I find it a lot easier to understand and remember things if I know why or how things are happening. So I would see someone doing something and I'd say like, why are you doing it that way? And they would take it as a, well, why are you doing it that way? I know a better way. But in reality it was, why are you doing that way? I want to understand. It's because a lot of the time autistic people will struggle to see from other people's perspectives, but we want to, but we just need you to explain your perspective to us. But neurotypical people don't often have that issue, so it comes across as a criticism. And I would say it's always better to go with a blanket assumption that a question is curiosity, and to answer that question honestly and kindly. If it then becomes clear that that person was actually trying to criticise you through that questioning, then you deal with it. But if it's ambiguous, always assume it's curiosity from an autistic person, because a lot of the time we're asking questions just because we want to understand. Now, the final one is one that I feel like is going to be a little controversial, but if you want to be a good autistic ally, you also have to be a good LGBT ally. And that is because autistic people are actually a lot more likely to be queer or trans, and actually disabled people in general are more likely to be LGBT. This is especially true for autistic people are more likely to be transgender. And the theory behind that is that basically us autistic people don't truly understand the concept of gender. It's such an ambiguous concept that was created by society, and as a result we never often feel like we fit into that mould. So it's actually very common for autistic people to identify as non-binary and to identify as queer. So yeah, if you want to support autistic people, you're also going to have to support the LGBT community, because a lot of the time there is crossover there. So those are just a few of the suggestions I have, and I'm sure there's more out there. So if you're an autistic person who has any other suggestions for allies, drop them down in the comments below. And if you have any questions about any of these, let me know in the comments. If you like this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to see more content from me. All of my social media links are in the description below. If you'd like to leave me a comment to let me know you are here, leave me some form of rainbow emoji. Thank you again for watching. Bye.